great, and the other one says, not really, we know everything about colour already. So, and we don't know the answer to this question, but I'm sure Patrick can ask some questions about it.
So, why don't we do it this way? We've got a good chunk of time.
Mm-hmm.
Have you pretty much covered what
Yeah, I've covered what I wanted to cover. Apart from I want to show that one clip at the end.
Oh, right.
The lizard. So.
Okay. Why don't we take a different approach? In other words, just sort of suspend what we've been talking about for a second or two. And let me, I think I want to put in a PowerPoint.
Sure. So, just throw it in the sun.
Because I may want to use some slides. I'm not
sure
where they are. But, let's see. I feel the urge to. Do we have any markers?
There's one perfect. There you
go. Okay. First of all, before I get rambling and talking, are there, based on what you've just seen, what's sort of on your mind? What are you puzzling through? What are some of the mysteries? Even if you don't even know how to name it, just try to point to it in some way. Let's see. Why don't we start with Andrew? We'll work our way over. Something that I thought of with sort of framing the scenario was there was a great Radio Lab podcast on forgetting. I want to say it was Uncovered, but anyway, that's besides the point. And the last episode was talking about how similar questions, not so much regarding artificial intelligence or artificial consciousness, but what it means to whether there's like intrinsic readiness or we just identify, something on the electromagnetic spectrum as red. And so there were a couple examples, but one example that they gave with the person they were interviewing, the scientist, I forget what his background was, and basically he sort of ran an experiment on his daughter, and basically very simply what he did is he practiced as she was, learning language and stuff, sort of pointing at things and, that's a name and identifying it. She never pointed up to the sky and said the sky was blue. He never directed, he never gave her sort of the knowledge that the sky was blue. And so when he would ask her what color is the sky, like she didn't have an answer. She was able to do that with a number of other objects, but so clearly there was some type of perception occurring, but she couldn't recognize it as blue. And sort of the setup for the episode relatedly was, I think like the color blue is never mentioned in the Odyssey, and how and whenever the sea is described, it's described as red. And so I guess ultimately the point that I'm bringing up is, never mind if we're in black and white, would we be able to recognize red? But if we lacked the language, if we lacked red, would we be able to recognize red? So it's sort of from the opposite.
There's another class I teach, which a lot of these guys have done, where we do colour theory in my intro class. And there's a few facts about colour. One is that it's spelled with a U, one spell. But colour is a subjective experience for humans, very much. We form our own mental models of colour. We have these waves of light on the electromagnetic spectrum, but our perception is totally subjective. Right. So
I'm going to make your response symptomatic.
Yeah.
Okay. Because in responding to Andrew's statement, you're zeroing in on the object, the activity of perception and so on. Mm-hmm. But there's another layer to what Andrew's saying, and it has to do with language acquisition. So one of the difficulties that people in theory and criticism and the philosophy of language have with people in computer science, okay, sort of where personification,
go at me now.
Right? We are frequently going to be attending to language and language acquisition. It's like we're noticing the window, right? So I need a marker, and I'll draw it on here because it's dried up.
Oh, okay. I can go and get one if you want.
So one of the things that happens in these conversations, to generalize, is
we're often talking about these objects over here like color, right? I'll even spell it with a U. So, and so what happens is when we're talking, those of us in the theories, the linguistics, the humanities side of things, let's say, right? We're often wanting to look at the window, right? We're often wanting to realizing that in a way this extends out and we're caught in the window itself. But we're often trying to draw attention to this thing. We have different words for it: language, discourse, many different other sorts of terms. But we're not so much interested in the object that we're studying, the color red, right? In this case, we're interested in the word red. We're interested in what happens when a child acquires and can say wed. Right? Does that make sense? And then gradually modify it and change the sound from w to r or to red, right? So here, let me give you a simple. It's a relatively simple paradigm. It comes from Freud and Lacan. Okay, so imagine from this point of view of language, the language acquisition in a subject. Imagine that we just have let me do it differently. Let's imagine that, can you see, am I on board? Yeah. Let's just imagine that we have something here that is living stuff. It's cells. These cells are dividing. These cells are just evolving, right? Growing and developing. And at some point, those cells acquire something like, we'll call it perception, right? And so let's say we have an infant, the infant's born and so on at different stages of development. So we have a kind of a timeline here, an invisible timeline. At some point, that organism now, with highly differentiated cellular systems and processes, acquires language, okay? So the reason I'm using these letters is because the person that came up with this was writing in French and thinking about German concepts. So don't worry about the letters so much. So what Lacanians call this position right here, they call this the real. Okay? What they call this, the emergence of this relation out of the real, they call the imaginary register. Is that working for you? Okay. And what they call this moment when the infant acquires language. So if we call a child an infant, it means that they can't yet speak. So once a child begins to acquire language, the child's no longer an infant, okay, in this vocabulary. So what happens is, with this development, you have sometimes it's called the falling into language, or it's the emergence of what the Lacanians call the symbolic register. Okay? So the three key terms inside of this Lacanian discourse are the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. And this is basically a map of the psyche. It's an abstraction, it's a generalization that Lacan and others who follow in his footsteps call, now, a lot of you have probably taken some psych classes, a lot more than maybe I have. So basically, this is a variation on a simpler scheme that you probably know something about, or have heard about at least. Id, ego, and superego. Okay? So it's essentially the same structure. Is the whole thing visible? I can't really tell. Yeah, okay. So this is just a simple way of beginning to think about what happens with the acquisition of language in a human child. But we can say that the whole diagram, the whole map, is an abstraction, it's a generalization for the human psyche. Okay? So now that we're adults, when we're kind of a happening, right? So my brain and my libido, and there's all kinds of things happening in our bodies that we're not conscious of. You know, think about all the work that our brain is doing to regulate our temperature, to digest our food, to keep us awake, things like that. If you had a little bit of caffeine before class, Right? There are all kinds of processes that are going on inside of us that we're not really aware of or under any kind of control. Okay? We're also caught up in the realm of perception. So we're hearing things and seeing things, but we're filtering those things out, and some wonderful work is going on in the brain to give us a sense that these things are all sort of unified in some way, right? That certain sensations and perceptions belong together and others don't. Okay? So this level of the psychical apparatus has to do with that level of perception. But we're also attending to language. So we have the language that we're hearing from the outside that's working on us, but we also have some kind of internal monologue that's going on inside as well. Okay? Now, any questions about this so far? It's just a very simple scheme. I'm going to call it, it's a map for the psychical apparatus. Yes?
Well, that may work for words, and that may be, like you said, for the case of a child learning. Mm-hmm. But I remember there recently this games journalist Jeff Gerstmann talked about how he's colorblind, and he's known that he's been colorblind for a while, and he knows that in playing games he's had to come across the color spectrum at times where that's a little difficult for him. And he recently got himself a pair of these sort of corrective color blindness correcting sunglasses. And one of the things that they sort of joked about was, hey, since they're supposed to be sunglasses, you're supposed to wear them outside. And also, like, you're not supposed to wear them while driving because, oh God, color, I didn't know that actually was that color. And this notion of freaking out because he didn't necessarily know what purple, what purple really looked like until now, and being that the guy's in his 30s or 40s.
So help me get to the point of your example. You're lost in the example.
What I'm getting at is that this model assumes that at the beginning that since this is from birth, that this assumes that the child has never been aware that something is colored red. Not that they've never seen anything as red, but they've never. I
don't think this model is taking a position on that debate as I presented it.
I guess what I'm asking is. In theory, is there any way to sort of how should the mind double back on itself? I guess, by which I mean this is sort of that's a model of a child learns something that something is red.
No.
Oh, okay.
No,
sorry.
I don't think so.
I don't think
I think you're pushing this way far, much too far ahead.
Okay.
It's not trying to explain that. It would be able, in some way, depending on introducing lots of other factors. This is just a simple, very rudimentary, very basic map to think about some of the questions that often get displaced or neglected for reasons that have to do with the rise of empiricism and positivism. Okay, so back to the point I was making about not seeing the window. Okay, we're often not attending to, when we're thinking about the world, when we're thinking about what is my knowledge of water, or if I'm thinking about whether I should wear my coat when it's cold, how do I come to an understanding of temperature, right? Well, I don't really have an understanding of temperature initially when I have to go to school and learn about thermometers and things like that, but I have an understanding of comfort in things when the air is cold or when it's warm. Is that making some sense?
I think so.
So these things have existence in our phenomenal world, okay? And we use words as we acquire language, right? So we have a perceptual, we're totally caught up in, our bodies are totally caught up in understanding, well, this room's a little warm, the air is kind of stale, it's cold outside, I better dress when I go outside. We have a sense of our total involvement in this lived world of experiences, right? These are sort of, I'm trying to speak to some of the things that Damien was saying about creating intelligent systems that will be able to talk, and using fuzzy logic, that will be able to talk about things within a certain parameter, right? Is my vocabulary working? So, am I making some sense?
I think so. I guess where my point comes in is, I guess, in relation to you know, artificial intelligence is after something has gone through fuzzy logic and learning, and you know, it's done a lot of machine learning for a while, and then it's introduced to something completely different, like, you know, for whatever reason, you know, they're told that something that they didn't know was blue actually was blue after an extended period of time. Like, how is there some sort of inherent, like, does that break the entire thing, or does that, like, is there a way that, like, there can be some sort of emergent, the machine sort of is able to adjust to that? I don't know.
Okay, I'm not sure how to respond to that either. Let me just get some responses to this, and then we'll go from there. Let's see, who wants to chat? Just give me a sense of your hand. First, we'll go here, then down and there. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know your name yet.
Trish.
Trish. Okay, Trish, and then John, and then Matt.
I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but the way that I'm kind of understanding what you're saying is, I just thought of an example. I work in the international building here, and so I've met a lot of Japanese students who, they actually have more tastes. Like, we've got our, you know, sour, sweet, bitter, but they have more words to describe tastes, and they have more words to describe specific emotions than we have. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually perceiving tastes that we're not perceiving, or they're, you know, feeling emotions that we're not feeling. They just have more specific words for them.
Okay, I'll come back to that. So,
Okay.
so you want to, so help me just
I guess that's just kind of
see if you can tell me what the point is that you're making, given that observation.
I'm feeling like that's what I was getting from your
So if we go back to my little window map here, that although there might be different words for this object, it's you want to say there's no real interaction between the word for the object and the object itself. It might seem, am I understand? It might seem like there's a difference because we have slightly different connotations in the words we use, or slightly different words that have different qualities to them, different connotations. But in fact, the object is the object. The spice is the spice,
right.
And it's going to be hot or not so hot.
I think she was also saying that the real is the same, the object's the same, the kind of imaginary register perceptions are the same, but the symbolic registers are different. Is that?
Yeah, like
Yeah. And I think that this model, this paradigm that I've been presenting, is going to be much more radically interactionist. So it's basically eventually going to say, no, that you can't easily differentiate the real, right, from the symbolic, and the real and the symbolic from the imaginary.
Can you explain that? What do you mean you can't differentiate them?
Because they act on each other in radically defining ways. So, and once you start to differentiate them, what ends up happening is you end up thinking about the world as objectively present or as derived, rather than as something immediate. And that's a vocabulary that I'll have to say more about, but that's how we talk about this stuff. Yes?
So I'm going to talk about this, I guess, in reference to the window idea, because I'm not still sure. I'm not sure I have a total working understanding of this.
Yeah, we're just getting started.
So, but I read, last year I read this really interesting study about the Himba people in Africa, and it's specifically about their language. They have, instead of, we have what, 7 color categories, 7 words for color categories, but in the Himba language they have 5, and they don't really map to any of ours either. They're like, they don't really, I mean, I saw an explanation of it, it didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't figure out why different colors belong to different colors in the city in those color categories. But the point is that they perceive colors differently. So that they did this test where they have like a bunch of squares of, they're all what we would call green, and there's one that's like very slightly off. And all the people who spoke Western language, any other language in the world, could tell which one was not the same green. But the Himba people the Himba people couldn't differentiate, right? Because or no, it might have been another. Okay, I'm getting it wrong.
I get the general point,
but the more striking one, the more striking one is because they look at colors that look all the same to us. But they can tell them apart because they belong to different color categories to them, but not to us. So they actually, even looking at the same object through the window, because they're looking through a different sort of window, I guess, they see things differently. is what I was trying
Right,
to
and are the two of you now disagreeing?
I think that's sort of a counterexample, actually.
Yeah.
So am I following you that the position you're taking and the position you're taking would lead to some kind of a disagreement?
I'm not taking a stance either
No,
way.
not
Right now.
just so I'm understanding, no, just for the purpose of understanding, you're saying different things.
Yeah, I feel like you're
Yeah.
saying the
Yeah.
opposite of what I'm saying.
And now you got a box.
And I'm agreeing with you.
Okay.
Okay. In other words, the position that I'm trying to articulate here. There's a problem with this map. Many problems with it, okay? One of the problems is that it seems to imply that perception and sensation precede the acquisition of language. And one of the things that your example is pointing out is that actually, these are not that easily separated. That the acquisition of language alters the nature of perception and the things perceived and sensed, right? That's sort of the implication behind this kind of observation. So we promised you're John. No, you're John. You're Matt.
I'm going to go back to this model. So this would all be before an infant acquires language.
Well, the infant actually,
At the start.
imagine a kind of a timeline that moves in this direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
This is the acquisition of language here.
okay. So from my understanding, like as an infant, you still experience things, but you can't you can't retrieve them in memory. So could that be because you can't articulate that correctly because you don't have language?
Well,
Like you feel what you feel, but you can't share it with somebody else
Yeah.
because you can't articulate it because you don't have language.
this very observation that you're making was one that fascinated Freud. Freud, in a case study that we call the Wolf Man, because this person came to see him when he was in his late teens, early 20s, and he said, I had a dream, and I dreamed of seeing wolves sitting in a tree. So we call him the Wolf Man. Well, in the Wolf Man case study, Freud actually ponders this very problem where he says, the infant, this wolf man, right, when he was a child, he perceived and he saw things like his parents making love, and that traumatized him, sort of, but it only traumatizes him retroactively. When he acquires language and learns about what sex is, then he's retroactively traumatized by this scene that happens in his childhood.
And he might
So
not
that's,
even,
yeah.
he later found that, I read a little bit about Freud and dreams and stuff.
Yeah.
You can't have a dream about something that you haven't seen before. Like that just doesn't come out of thin air. You've seen it before. You just can't really retrieve it in your memory as of yet. That's what
It's something like that. It's a little bit different, but yeah, it's something like that. Okay, a number of other people want to join in. So your name is
Joe.
Joe?
Sesta.
Okay, Joe.
It was funny when you brought that up because I had the HIMBA study I already had open in one of my tabs.
Okay.
It was one of the ones I linked to you on Canvas, and it was really interesting. It's just to see it was saying they only have one word for orange, red, and like dark red is just surroundu. And so after showing like an orange tile, they'd call it surroundu, and then later, you know, a darker red one, and they'd be like, that's the same one, they think.
So they didn't make a distinction between dark red and orange?
It's all surrounded to them.
Okay, okay. But we obviously make the distinction between red and orange.
But I thought some even more striking ones that like there are certain yellows and blues are in the same category.
Okay.
And like a lighter yellow and a lighter blue in the same category, and then there's like darker yellows and darker blues that are in different categories.
Mm-hmm.
So like the red and orange one is one that like kind of it makes some intuitive sense to us, but there are, like I said, there are ones that just don't make any sense. I had no understanding at all, and it doesn't even seem to match. Even seems to match with like a spectrum of wavelength or anything. You know. So, and I don't know. The point is that it's really confusing to me because I don't know those words.
Where are you confused?
No, I'm confused as to how they group their like.
Oh, you're confused on the details of this particular people.
Yeah, I'm just saying that because I didn't learn the language, I didn't acquire language the same way that they did. That my perception, I can't understand my perception of color.
Well, it's a little tricky statement there.
Or
Maybe, do we all acquire language in the same way?
Or I didn't
just
acquire
a different
I didn't
language?
acquire the same language is what I acquired.
Yeah, okay.
But this is fascinating from an artificial intelligence point of view, and we will talk about this. The artificial intelligence cuts into categories. One's a kind of rule-based systems that are based on language and machine learning systems that aren't. And so we'll be introducing those two over the next week.
Yes.
So, question, the real, is that being presented as unalterable?
No, just imagine it as just a chaotic play of forces, okay, that are organic and inorganic, right? Just imagine it as the entire cosmos without any differentiation at all. Just competing, collapsing, and shifting and changing differences. It's what Nietzsche would call the will to power. Okay?
You lost me with that one.
Did I?
It seems a strange concept.
Imagine the cosmos without consciousness.
Okay.
Okay? Everything. Just
The
imagine.
physicality.
Imagine everything that's. Pardon?
The physicality.
Well, it might not only be physical,
Okay.
because physical is a concept.
Right. Well, it's everything before our brains have a chance to order it.
Yeah, but then even our brains are in there,
Oh, yeah.
right? Because it's just part of the soup.
Right.
Right.
Sorry, could you just elaborate a little more on the imaginary register? I'm getting the real and the symbolic. I'm trying to work on the imaginary.
The imaginary, in terms of the psychoanalytic theory, this is often called the mirror stage. And so imagine all those paintings that you see of Madonna's nursing the child, a mother nursing its child, and the child is nursing and staring into the mother's eyes. So the child, imagine that there's a position here for the child where it says to itself, I am there. Let's imagine the child sees its reflection in its mother's eyes. Okay, so the child might say, that's me, right? And this is without language. This is why it's hard to explain this way, because in this schema, there isn't language acquisition yet. So there's some mode of recognition or something like that that seems to happen here. And if that's the case, and I'm not sure this is the case, okay, but in this scenario, there's a kind of relation that is constituted. And the relation that gets constituted basically says, this image up here is me. But this is an image of, say, something like wholeness. But the argument is that this position experiences itself as fragmented. So that there's a tension in the creation of this moment that's sometimes called the relation between the ego and the ego ideal. Now, on this model, if you just remember this phrase, it'll help you. The ego is mad, okay? The ego is a lie. The ego isn't really the whole thing or even just part of the thing. The ego is just a development within a larger system, within a larger set of systems. Okay, is that working for you?
Yeah,
so basically, in the simplest of terms, it's what happens when you and I we were these little organisms. And so these cells started to divide, and they started to differentiate. Well, they get to the point somewhere along the line, in utero or sometimes after, where there's still development going on. And it's the development of perceptual and sensation and sensuous processes and the organisms that are necessary to carry those things through in the brain and the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system.
I'm aware of the time.
How are we? Oh, I lost all track.
Yeah,
Is it time to go to the lizards?
Well, we've got one last thing to show. I wanted to show.
Okay, so I can't see the clock.
It's 7:15.
Okay, let me just make one other quick point that I'll come back to. I'm going to be talking about the different kinds of things that we do with language. And I'm just going to give you some words to keep in mind. We define things, and when we were listening to Damien at the first half of the class tonight, we talked a lot about defining our terms. So I want to talk about the difference between description and definition, and prescription and description. Okay, so I'm going to be playing around with these different kinds of ways in which we use language whenever we're thinking about consciousness, machines, our own subjectivity, and things like that. So anyway, this is just a very preliminary way of thinking about our larger human world. I'm also going to talk about, as we move forward, and I'll give you some readings about this as well. I'll be posting stuff on the Canvas site. We'll be looking at some texts that will give us different kinds of language for what we are as human beings. So in the ancient world and through the Middle Ages, we had a very different way of talking about ourselves than we did after Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. Okay? So most of the discourse that surrounds discussions about artificial consciousness, artificial intelligence, artificial learning. Most of this vocabulary is post-Cartesian vocabulary, okay? But what I'm going to be suggesting is most of the problems, most of the interesting problems about artificial consciousness, artificial intelligence, artificial life, artificial learning, that these are pre-Cartesian issues. So that we're caught up in an historical moment where we're using a vocabulary that's not working for us, okay? That we have to find a different kind of vocabulary in an earlier historical period to think about the problems that we're debating, okay? So it's time for your lizard show.
Lizard show.
And I think what you do, you go back to the computer?
Yeah.
I'll let you do it.
Let me. Where's your working? So a couple of minutes of this. So in this particular